Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our second week on this topic of the human digestive system. I hope that you had a good weekend and that you're ready to go again with our learning. Now, remember last week we were talking about the three different types of nutrients that are found in our food. And I introduced you to these three models or diagrams which represent the three main types of nutrients that we can find in our food. Do you still remember what each of these models or diagrams represent? Pause for a while and try to recap and to refresh your knowledge. Now hopefully you remembered that this model here represents starch. And starch is an example of a carbohydrate. And hopefully you remember that each of these little green circles here represents glucose, right? Glucose is represented by this little green circle. Glucose is the simplest form of carbohydrates, and when we join many units of glucose together, we get starch. Now hopefully you also remembered what this model represents, that it represents a protein, and that each of these shapes here represents an amino acid. And remember that there were 20 different types of amino acids, and when you join different amino acids together, you can form a great variety of protein. Now finally, this model here represents fat. And hopefully you can remember that fat is made out of glycerol, and also over here represented by the squiggly lines, fatty acids. And that usually it is 3 fatty acids to 1 glycerol. Alright, so get that in your head, and we're going to move on from there now. And we're going to be moving on to a very important question. And that question is, why do we even need digestion in the first place? I mean, why does food need to be digested in the first place? Why is there a need for digestion? Now I want to start exploring that question by asking you to imagine something. And I want you to imagine that this here is one of the many cells in your body. Now in the last chapter we learned that our body is made up of many cells. Now each and every one of these cells needs glucose and starch, a carbohydrate, for energy. They need carbohydrates for energy. Without carbohydrates, our cells will die and will not survive. Now where can the cells get carbohydrates from? Food, of course, and here is an example of a food which contains glucose and starch, carbohydrates. Nasi lemak. So I hope that you've had your breakfast and that this isn't causing your mouth to water. Now anyway, nasi lemak contains glucose and starch, right? And the part of the nasi lemak which contains the most glucose and starch, I hope it occurred to you that is in the rice, right? The rice contains all the glucose and starch. Now question, how can the cell in my body get the glucose and starch from this nasi lemak here? Can the cell just eat the nasi lemak? Or can I just take the nasi lemak and stuff it inside my cell? Put it differently, can my cell get glucose directly from the food? Can it just get it directly from the food without me having to do anything to the food? Now if you're thinking, then hopefully your answer is no, it's not possible. It's ridiculous, right? I can't just take this nasi lemak and stuff it inside my cell. And that's because my cell is very small compared to the nasi lemak, right? So that's not possible. So, what needs to happen to this food such that the glucose and starch inside the food can become available for the cells in my body? Well, first, you need to break it down. The food needs to be broken down. It needs to be digested. Right? And that's why food needs to be digested. Now, the rest of this video will be looking at this question, why does food need to be digested? And then in the next video, we'll look at the two main types of digestion, physical digestion and chemical digestion. And we'll talk about the differences. Now, this can be found in your textbook on these pages. Now, you should be following me on this set of notes. Digestive Notes 2. Looks something like this. Alright, so follow me through this set of notes. Why must food be digested? And then we'll talk about the two types of digestion. Alright, so flip to your page 1 of the notes and let's get going. Now, when I was young, I watched this cartoon called Tom and Jerry. I'm not sure how many of you guys watched it too, but it's all about a cat chasing a mouse and, never succeeding. So here's our cat, Tom, and he's chasing Jerry, and he's like, oh, he's running around, and the music's, he's gonna get, and they run into a fence. So what's gonna happen now is, of course, Jerry manages to make it through the fence, woohoo, but Mr. Tom, the cat, well, he gets his paw stuck, and so he becomes a very sad cat. Now, why can't the cat catch the mouse in this case? I hope you realize that it's because the cat is too big, right? It's too big to pass through the fence. Now, question for you. How is this fence similar to the cell membrane? Or how is the cell membrane like a fence? Now, I hope you remember that the cell membrane, when we were learning about it, has a very special property. The cell membrane is partially permeable, right? It allows some substances to pass through, but not others. Just like this fence allows the very small mouse to pass through, but not the bigger cat, the cell membrane lets certain small substances pass through, but not the larger ones. And that's going to be important in the next slide. So hold that thought about the cell membrane for a while, and we're going to see why it's important to this question. Why must food be digested? Now remember I said that every cell in our body, each and every one, needs nutrients to survive. So here's the cell, and it needs nutrients to survive. And here's the cell membrane, which is partially permeable. Now, here's the issue. Food, like my nasi lemak, contains large and complex food molecules. For example, starch. Starch is very large. Protein is very large, and fat is also very large. So food contains large and complex food molecules, like starch, protein, and fat, which cannot pass through the partially permeable cell membrane. So here's a diagram of some food. In fact, this diagram represents starch. Right? You can see that it's made up of many repeating units of glucose. And starch is such a large and complex food molecule that it cannot pass through the cell membrane. It is far too big. So something needs to happen to starch. And here's what it is. Large and complex food molecules, they need to be broken down into small and simple molecules that can be absorbed into the cells. So here it is. Starch is broken down to small and simple molecules that can pass through the cell membrane, right? These smaller molecules can pass through, and of course, if that was starch, then these smaller molecules here each one of them represents glucose. Alright, so here are the keywords. Large and complex food molecules, for example, starch, right, needs to be broken down into small and simple molecules, for example, glucose, that can then be absorbed into the cell. Okay, so large and complex, broken down to small and simple. Alright, just some further examples for us. So, large and complex food molecules need to be broken down to small and simple food molecules, which can then be absorbed into our body's cells, so that it's useful to our cells. Now, starch is an example of that large and complex food molecule, and starch, we know, is broken down to something that's small and simple. It needs to be broken down to glucose, which can then be absorbed into cells. Proteins are also far too large to enter cells, so they need to be broken down into amino acids in order to be absorbed into cells. Finally, fats are also just far too big to enter cells, so they need to be broken down to something small and simple, which is fatty acids and glycerol. Now in this form, the nutrients can then be absorbed into the cells. So we're going to end with this slide for this video. What then is digestion? Digestion is the breakdown of, again, large and complex food molecules into smaller and simpler food molecules that can be absorbed into cells. Alright, so just get this definition right, what digestion is. And there are two types of digestion: physical digestion and chemical digestion. And we'll be talking a bit more about that in the next video. Alright, see you there.